Hi, and welcome to Mailbag Monday. This is Scott Ford from MrFordsClass.net, and it is currently July 14th, 2013. This is our second official Mailbag Monday video. Again, keeping it pretty casual. Got the coffee going here. So after I did the first video on generally how to prepare for exams, I was swamped by several different emails regarding what the next video should be. And one of the common themes that emerged from several of the emails was how to take notes in class. Let me give this kind of heads up right now. How to take notes in class is very subjective. It's very much up to the individual. What you're trying to do when you take, actually the only rule for taking notes in class is that they should be something that works for you. So maybe in high school or other programs you learned about Cornell note-taking, or you learned about other methods of note-taking, and maybe they weren't for you. Well, then stop doing them. You have to figure out what works for you, what's the best way that works for you in taking notes. All those other note-taking strategies or note-taking courses or note-taking things that you learned should be there as something that you try, and if they work for you, keep going. If parts of it work for you, then keep those parts. But again, the first rule in taking notes is it has to work for you. If you're doing Cornell note-taking or some other method of taking notes perfectly, and you get home at the end of the day and it's not helping you, then okay, great, you're doing the note-taking perfectly, but the objective of taking those notes, of actually learning something from them, isn't doing anything for you, so stop doing that. There are some general suggestions I can offer you on taking notes and how to prepare for it. I personally hate taking notes in class. My personal learning style is I like to sit in class and I like to listen to the lecture. I like to get the big picture as far as the information goes. And so what I found in my time as a student is that if I sit there and I'm busy taking notes, then I miss big picture items. I miss kind of the grand scheme of what the professor was talking about. And so in general, I won't take notes in class. And it took me a while to become okay with that, because I would sit there, listening to the instructor while people were busy taking notes, and I always felt like I should be taking notes, that I was doing something wrong. And in fact, no, that was just my learning style, was not to take notes, but to listen to instruction. I would say, first off, before you decide to take notes or not, you have to figure out if you need to take notes. Some professors, some instructors, some teachers get information right out of the book. I mean, they are going verbatim out of the book. I had one graduate assistant who taught a psychology class, a personality class, when I was an undergrad back at University of South Florida. And nice guy, and you could tell he was nervous, and this was the first time he was doing the job, but he was reading word for word out of the textbook. I mean, literally, he was reading the book to us. And so in those situations, you didn't need to take notes. You really didn't need to take any notes because he was reading the book. I would also suggest, so that if you do have to take notes, so let's say you have a professor who isn't using the book, who is lecturing off on their own. Does the professor provide handouts? Is the professor providing lecture notes? Do they provide some sort of material that you can use for notes and fill in the blanks? So for example, in my face-to-face class, as well as on my website, MrFordsClass.net, I make available PDF copies of my notes. So my PowerPoint's there in PDF form as 1 slide per page. Then I also have them as 6 slides per page, so those are there so they can take notes. I want students in my class to be able to pay attention to what I'm saying and to ask questions, as opposed to spending the entire class writing things down. So step number 1, let me write this down so remember the steps I'm telling you about. So step number 1 is step number 1 is do what works for you, right? So do what works for you. And once again, that was, if you know how to take Cornell notes or any other type of note taking and it's not working for you, but you take perfect notes, then stop doing that, because ultimately that's not doing it. You're supposed to be taking notes to help you. Step 2. So step 1 was do what works for you. Step 2 was determine whether or not you even need to take notes. Is the professor lecturing from the book, or are they lecturing from something that's not in the book, or are they providing handouts or notes? So Step 2 is to determine, do you need to take notes? The next thing is to figure out what to take notes on. During a lecture, a instructor, depending on the university, depending on the college, even in the classroom, sometimes instructors have to teach bell to bell. What I mean by this is when the bell rings till the bell ends, they have to fill that time in. And this is much more common, I would say, in the K-12 situation, the kindergarten through 12th grade, the public school systems. Because if you get everything done in 30 minutes, you can't just let the students go and say, okay, we're done, we covered everything, hey, we're doing really good, go away. You have to keep them for the rest of your time. In a lecture environment, universities especially, you don't really need to keep students as long. So professors in a full university have a lot more leeway, typically, and this has been changing over the last few years, whether or not they have to keep students the entire time for their scheduled time. Teaching at the community college, which is what I do up here in North Virginia, we are encouraged to keep the students for the entire time. However, in reality, you know what, we're teaching adults here, and I don't keep my students for the entire time. I cover what I need to cover for that day. Plus, I have all my videos online so they can watch stuff as well. So I cover what I need to cover. All of this to make this one point. Pick up on the important parts that the instructor is talking about, what the instructor is stressing. You don't want to take notes on every word the person says. So, for example, in this video alone, there has been some filler. And I've made a point to say, here's number 1, here's number 2. I've made a point to illustrate what's important to know. This is what you have to do in class. Pay attention to the big ticket items. You're looking for key words, key phrases, key expressions that tip you in on, okay, this is important to this instructor. This is important. This could show up on an exam. So, for example, in my class, when we talk about the cell is the basic unit of life. Anytime you hear basic unit or founding father of, or some sort of major item, those are usually good test items. Now, I typically bring my students' attention to specific items, saying, okay, this is important. This is on the exam. I may knock on something. I may repeat it. Always watch out for professors repeating things. If they're repeating things, that's probably a good indication that it's important, and that's something you should take a note on. Again, you don't want to write out every word they say. What you want to do in a lecture situation is jot down enough of an aid to memory so that when you get out of the classroom, you can elaborate on that. You don't want to write down verbatim every ands, ifs, pauses, that the professor says, only to miss the next important thing they say. You want to just jot down something, highlight something, make a note of something so you can come back to it later. Your job is not a court reporter. Well, unless you're a court reporter, in which case, no worries. But if you're in your class, your job is not to create a manuscript, a transcript of everything the instructor said. You want to focus on the key points. So I would say rule number 3 in this situation is focus on key points. Okay, so focus on key points. And here's my little notes. Here's what I'm keeping for notes right here. Okay, ooh, not very pretty, not good handwriting. Okay, but I'm focusing on the key points that I'm making in this video, because when I go back and edit it, I'll maybe put up a slide or something that reinforces those points. So I'm making very short little notations to myself. The writing's not great. I can still read it, but I'm making sure I do number 3, which is focus on key points. Number 4, this is a kind of an easy one. Read the material before you go to class. You don't have to memorize the material before you go to class, unless you have a quiz on it when you show up, but you want to be familiar with the material the instructor is going to talk about. You won't know if the instructor is reading from the textbook or reading from another materials unless you're familiar with the materials ahead of time. Being familiar with the materials helps you narrow in on stuff you don't know. So, for example, if you show up to class raw, you've never read the materials, you have no idea what they're talking about, you show up there completely blank slate, tabula rasa, when you show up, you don't know what you should already know. You don't know what's already in the book. You don't already know the no-brainers. And so you think everything's important. You want to have already become familiar with the materials in that lecture before you show up, because that will also narrow in on what you then need to take notes on to go study additionally. It also adds to conversations. I always like to ask questions in my class, and I tell you, as an instructor, I can very quickly figure out if anybody's been reading the material beforehand, because I'll ask questions, or more importantly, questions that are asked sometimes key me in that person isn't doing their part of their work. They're not preparing for class. They're not reading for class. They're not preparing for class. So, again, rule number 4 is, let's say, come prepared. And what I mean by that, again, is, let's say, come prepared, be familiar with the material for the day. So we have 4 things so far. Let's see, what could be number 5? Number 5 is, let's say, ask questions. Ask questions in class. The last thing you want to do is ask the professor, is this going to be on the test? Because even if it wasn't, it is then, okay, for a lot of professors. If you go, is this on the test? And sometimes the professors will go, no. Sometimes they'll go, well, it is now. Most times they become offended. Now, I, as an instructor, always tell my students when I'm going off on a tangent, when I'm going on an FYI. So, but number 5 is ask questions. Seek clarification. So ask questions. Seek clarifications. This very much ties back in with number 4, which is come prepared, because if you seek clarification on a question that is pretty simple in the readings, as an instructor, we know that you didn't do any of the readings. But if you ask a good question, then the instructor knows that you are paying attention and that it might be a good question. And by the way, this is also a great way to then get letters of recommendation from instructors. You better make sure your professor remembers you in a positive way, and one of the ways you do that is by asking challenging and intelligent questions in class, being the person who's always prepared. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 6. Number 6. When you get out of class, expand upon your notes. So let's say 6 is review notes ASAP, as soon as possible after lecture. So number 6 is review your notes as soon as possible after lecture. And by the way, like the previous videos, this is all very informal. This is all me having a chat with a microphone and a webcam to you guys out there. So there's obviously other opinions out there on how to take notes. These are just things that occur to me that could be helpful. So again, number 6 is review notes as soon as possible after your lecture. You've jotted down your notes, okay? So for example, you've been jotting down your chicken scratch, okay? You've been jotting down your notes. After you get done in the class, you don't want to let those notes sit around for a week or 2 days or how many days it is until your next meeting without acting upon them. You want to then go back and review them, and now is the time to elaborate on what you have written. So you might have had some chicken scratch before. And by the way, for those who aren't familiar with the colloquialism chicken scratch, this is chicken scratch. This is just me jotting things down in a messy way. That's chicken scratch. You want to go back and review that. You want to go back and look at that chicken scratch that you've done. And we could turn this into a drinking game. Every time Mr. Ford says chicken scratch, drink some coffee. Hold on. So, yeah, anyways. Back to the chicken scratch. You want to elaborate on your notes. You want to go back to your notes. You want to pull them out. You want to add material to them. I would also say get the textbook, if you're using a textbook, and then go back and highlight, along with your notes, the information that they covered. So you want to go back through the notes, go back through the book, and go and highlight that information that instructor thought was important. Let's do a 6A. So a 6A highlighter. I love my highlighters. In fact, I got one right here. I'm preparing, after I'm done recording this video, I've got a paper I've got to write. Love my highlighter. Highlighters are awesome, okay? Yellow, by the way, is my preferred one because yellow is the only one that you can photocopy over and it looks fine. But I love yellow. You want to use yellow for your highlighting, or you can use any color you want. I just hate all the multicolor stuff. Yellow works for me. And go back and highlight the stuff that they covered in the lecture notes and make sure that you've got that going on. Oh, by the way, totally FYI, supposedly there are studies that have been done that say that yellow is your best bet for writing stuff down on in school. Supposedly the color yellow is supposed to help you memorize stuff, helps the memory. So in the world of anatomy and physiology, any little bit could help. So who knows there. So once again, let's go over some basic ideas that I use when I make my notes. Number one was do what works for you. You are you. You are the only you that's out there. You have unique learning styles. You have ways that you learn that you've developed over the years. You do what works for you. Now, let me add a little bit more to that one. You have to figure out what works for you. Many of the students that I have in my class have either A, gotten through high school pretty easily and never had to learn how to study because they just breezed through it. And now they're in college, and all of a sudden, yikes, they have to study. And this was me, by the way, when I was in college. I never learned how to study. I never learned what my modalities of learning were. And so I had to learn very quickly, what worked for me, what didn't work for me. Find out what works for you. Okay, my advice might work for you, it might not work for you. Parts of it might work, parts of it might not work. Just because it's coming from Mr. Ford does not mean that it is gospel truth. Except when I'm talking about the bones, in which case, yeah, that's what they call it. But this is my opinion. This is my advice to you. And that's exactly what this is, advice, meaning you can take it or leave it, or take parts and leave other parts. So figure out what works for you. Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? Let me make a note of that. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Are you visual or audio? Okay. Are you tactile? What works for you? And so you have to figure out that first of all, and then go with that strength. 2, do you need to take notes at all? Is this something that's already available? Is this something not available? Are they reading from the book? Are they going off their own? Do you need to take notes at all? 3, focus on key points. Don't try to write down everything they say. You'll never get through it. Focus on the key issues, the things that are going to show up in the exam, or things that you didn't know. 4, come prepared, come familiar with the materials for that day. 5, ask questions, seek clarification. This ties back in with 4. If you don't know what you're supposed to already know by now, asking questions can be a little risky because you might ask a question you're supposed to already know. So always coming prepared is a good idea. But again, don't let that scare you from asking questions. A lot of professors out there that are good professors don't mind questions. In fact, I personally hate a quiet room. Hate it. 6, review notes as soon as possible after you leave the lecture. Elaborate on them. 6A, use your highlighter. We have some amazing new technology devices, okay? We've got smartphones. I don't have my iPad on me, but we have iPads. We have digital recorders. You can record your instructor. If you're not, remember going back to number 1, do what works for you. If you don't like to write notes, if you're completely auditory and you don't like to write notes, record them. Record the lectures, okay? Record what they're saying. Here is a warning on this one, however. Most instructors, most reasonable instructors, don't mind you recording them. However, you should always let your professor know and ask your professor ahead of time if it's okay to record. So while most professors don't care if you record, it is a courtesy to let them know and to ask them if it's okay to record. And then when you're done recording the lectures, go back to number 6, which is as soon as possible, review your notes. Let's go with number 8. And this is very specific for anatomy and physiology, and that is note cards. And in my lecture videos, I stressed the need for note cards. You should be making note cards in anatomy and physiology. Again, this is pretty unique to A&P. I discovered once I started doing note cards for A&P that I use note cards for other things as well. And what I mean by this is you take index cards, and on one side you put a word, and the other side you put more information, and you take them with you and you record them, or you review them. Another good thing about that is you're having to read the information and then summarize the information. That always is a helpful way to learn the material. So I gave you 8 general ideas on how to do notes. Again, these are just my personal opinions. These are things that work for me because number one is do what works for you. Take this, again, these suggestions with a grain of salt. Try them. And if they work for you, go for it. If they don't work for you, don't use them. If some of them work for you, use those. And if some of them don't work for you, then don't use those. So anyways, that's going to wrap it up. I don't want to make this video too long. As it is, we are quite a bit long. We're at 22 minutes. So thank you for bearing with me. And that'll be it. Next Monday, we'll have our next Monday mailbag. So if you have any questions between now and then, please be sure to email me at mrford@mrfordsclass.com. And be sure to visit mrfordsclass.net. And if you like what you see there in the anatomy videos, please consider joining. It's what allows us to continue to make these videos and keep the power on. Or if you just want to buy me a cup of coffee for our next video, I'm putting a link in there too. You can just do a donation and make sure my coffee supply is well stocked. Anyways, until later, have a great time out there. Enjoy your studying, become smarter, become more well educated, and we'll see you for our next video next week.